So we kind of learned about how it was for rich people. Now we're going to learn about what this time period felt like from the perspective of women and children. So this right here is a horn book. This is the way that children learned to read. They learned the very rudiments of reading, their alphabet, and the reading of one syllable, phonemes, and then the Lord's Prayer there. The other good thing about a horn book from the perspective of the teacher is you could use it to spank a recalcitrant child, but this is, the first sort of teaching tool. And I will be talking more about education in this time period. Okay. This right here is a page from the New England Primer, one of the first textbooks ever produced in British North America. Take a moment to look at what's on the screen there and tell me what you notice about any of the verses. Oops, sorry.
It seems very macabre, like Edgar Allan Poe kind of vibe to it.
Yeah, there's a lot of death here, huh? Youth's forward slips, death soonest nips. That skeleton chasing that guy. Xerxes the Great did die, so must you and I. Time cuts down all, both great and small. This is how people learn how to read. It's kind of like an ABC book. And yet a lot of it is very dark and grim. Notice anything else?
It all rhymes.
It does rhyme. And sometimes we can learn how people pronounce things differently in the time period that we're studying by looking at what words they think rhyme. Like, I have a student who is doing a MA thesis about songs of the American Revolution, and they rhyme things like stay and play with America because they pronounced it Amerique in this time period. So the other thing I wanted you guys to notice is that there's a lot of biblical stuff going on, religion, because this is a New England product. So people are very, very familiar with Bible stories, and religion is like really inextricable from the early childhood curriculum. Oh, there's another death. I didn't notice that one. Rachel doth mourn for her firstborn. Tiny baby coffin there.
Time cuts down all, both great and small.
Yeah. One of the things that is notable about Puritan New England is the emphasis on children being ready to die. Like, it was drilled into children that they ought to make themselves ready for death because they could die at any time. So when little kids were buried, it was a parade of other little children that would accompany the tiny coffin to the grave. And people were really encouraged to contemplate their death. The sort of odd thing about that is there was not a corresponding get out of jail free card in terms of here's what you can do to make sure you don't go to hell, because remember, there was predestination. But children were always being prepared to meet the end.
Odd question, I think, but when did that mentality shift? At what time did we stop basically saying, hey, guess what? You're probably gonna die if you don't be extremely careful. I don't know. I understand that once you got through childhood, your chances of survival were much higher. So when did we stop telling kids that? I'm just curious.
Well, there begins to be more of an emphasis in the early 19th century on the role of mothers in keeping their children safe, and a lot less emphasis on drilling into the children that they should be ready to die. So that's part of the shift. Another part is the development of inoculation for infectious disease, which starts in the 1720s in America. Smallpox was a great killer of people in the 18th century. And it was noticed by a New England preacher and a doctor simultaneously that if you took some matter from inside the sore of somebody with an active case of smallpox and you poked it with a needle into somebody else's arm, you could make them have a mild case of smallpox that normally they wouldn't die from. So inoculation with some live smallpox virus came before the smallpox vaccination that Edward Jenner, got from cowpox. And so when there started to be more that people could do to control infectious disease, it seemed less like the judgment of God every time somebody died and more like, oh, maybe there's some stuff we can do to help people live. So I would say the time period between 1720 and about 1800, you get a shift in the consideration of childhood death. Historians also talk a lot about the so-called invention of childhood in this period, and this is a sort of a dubious thesis, but if you look at portraits of children, there are way more portraits as you get further along in time of children doing childish things, playing with toys, dressed in children's clothes and baby clothes, as opposed to if you look early in American history or in European history, children look like little adults. So historians think, oh, well, then some historians think the nature of childhood was changing and people were beginning to have more appreciation of how much children could absorb about the world or should be asked to absorb about the world. Sorry about the long-winded answer. Okay, before the American Revolution, women had daily lives of unremitting toil, and that was just kind of expected. God and nature, it was widely thought, had made women physically weaker vessels, but had fitted them for various kinds of tasks, and this was women's work. The Bible, too, emphasized that a godly housewife should be able to do all these things, should be able to raise children, cook, clean, plant gardens, make things for use around the house. Women tended to get up in the morning before it was light out, to prepare breakfast, to start fires in the fire grates, to feed and water any livestock, awaken the children, churn butter, tend gardens, milk cows, cook dinner. And these were things that were done daily, but there were also tasks that were seasonal or weekly. Like before you could go to the store and buy a loaf of bread, you had to bake. And if you've ever baked fresh bread, it doesn't last that long. So they had to bake at least a couple of times a week. They also did their own brewing. A good housewife knew how to brew beer at home. They had to make their own clothing. So things like spinning yarn and weaving and knitting fell to women. Women made candles and soap. They collected firewood. They hauled water. They washed clothing, which was super duper difficult. You had to boil a big cauldron of water and put, so boil the water, put the clothes in it, swish the clothes around the cauldron with a big paddle, pull the clothes out, and then with a scrubbing board or rocks, get the dirt out of the clothes, and then hang the clothes to dry, and then flat iron the clothes with an iron that is very heavy, sits in the fire, and you iron the clothes, and then you have to put the flat iron back in the fire because it gets cold, so you're switching off with several flat irons. I mean, this was really unremitting work, but women expected it. Some women had special skills to fill important niches in the community. One example is Martha Ballard, who was a midwife in Maine. And we know about her because she left a diary that covers about 50 years worth of, no, maybe less, 30 years worth of her life. She delivered 800 babies in that amount of time. She lost very few babies and only 2 mothers in childbirth. She was also a local pharmacist. She had her own garden with medicines in it. She was who you called if you needed medical assistance in the time of an epidemic, and she was who prepared the bodies for burial. So somebody like that, you know, had a lot of jobs to do. These were considered women's jobs, and there were midwives in every community pretty much, because otherwise everybody would die before they were born. The legal status of women, though, was that they didn't have a legal status. Due to the doctrine of coverture, women were not separate legal persons in their own right, but were subsumed in or covered by the legal personality of their husband or father. So they couldn't sue in court, they couldn't sign contracts in their own name, they couldn't will their own property. They really were legal non-persons. The only the only exception to this rule was widows. Sometimes widows inherited property from their husbands, and then they could act as separate legal persons because they didn't have a husband or a father. Women also could not vote. They couldn't hold office. They had no formal access to education. Divorces were really impossible, although desertions were pretty common. Now, why were women excluded from political participation? Because it was thought that, like children, like people with mental illness, like felons who had lost the right to participate, they were not fit for political participation, that they somehow fell short of the rationality needed to participate politically. As a result of which, as we get into this period where people are talking about, you know, everybody gets together in a social contract and you have a right to dissolve the bands of government if you are not getting life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You know, women are really excluded from all of these discussions. And things that had to do with women were used as insulting names, insulting name calling. So if you want to insult a guy, call him womanly. If you want to praise someone, call him manly. Question? During the American Revolution, women, some women, started to play more of a role in British North American life. At first, it was thought that women could not be patriotic because they lived in a society that it didn't matter what kind of politics were in that society. They were under the rule of their husbands. That's called patriarchy. And yet some women did start to demonstrate patriotism in their own right through independent political action. The women who were left behind when husbands went off to fight took on men's roles at home. They oversaw the farm. They kept the books. They plowed fields. They melted down pots and pans to make bullets. Women also went into the field with their husbands, doing all of the ancillary jobs that are today done by people in the armed forces. So they cooked, they did nursing, they made bandages, they set up tents. There are a couple examples of women actually helping their husbands on the front lines. When the war was over, wealthy women raised money to help orphan children or widowed women. They formed committees to raise money to buy bandages or to, help out in other ways by forming committees. And they were liable to be raped because rape was an act of wartime atrocity that was practiced by both sides, by both the British and the American soldiers. If you're wondering who were the American soldiers raping, let me tell you that if 1/3 of the population was Tories, that is loyalists, many times husbands would leave to go to England or to go to Canada and leave their women and children, loyalist women and children at home, where they were subject to all kinds of persecution. The reason we know this is that after the war was over, the women petitioned the American government for redress, for reparations about how they had been treated. So that is how we know that. All right, I'm going to do one more slide today. On the right-hand side of the slide here, we have Deborah Sampson. She participated in the American Revolution for 2 years, disguising herself as a man. She cut her hair short. She bound up her chest. She put on a uniform. She fought from 1780 to 1782 with the Massachusetts Regiment. She was wounded twice, once in the leg, which wound she treated herself. And then she was wounded again in the chest, but that was a wound that sort of knocked her out. And so when a doctor took her clothes off to treat her chest wound, he noticed that she was a woman, and sort of that was the end of the disguise. How do we know about Deborah Sampson? Well, she applied for a pension as a veteran of the Revolutionary War. So again, this is how we know, this is how historians know from the records. One of the only cases that is really popularly known about women having anything to say about the American Revolution is this famous letter that Abigail Adams wrote to John Adams. It was during the time that independence was being contemplated, so this is during the Second Continental Congress. And Abigail Adams was very insistent that John Adams should take into account how women were treated in the new republic. Remember the ladies, she said. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. So she basically says no taxation without representation. And he wrote back saying, oh, what's next? Slaves are going to rebel against their masters, apprentices are going to rebel against their shop owners. He didn't take it super seriously, but this is one of the sort of only examples that we have of women talking about how their rights were impacted by the revolution. Okay, this is a good place to stop. I will finish with this lecture and part of lecture 12 the next time we meet. And are there any questions?
No, ma'am.
All right. Would it be okay, you guys, if Thursday's class was on Zoom? The reason is I have to give a midterm right after this. I teach 201 and 202, and I need to be in front of a computer in case anything gets screwed up with that midterm. And I don't have time to get back to my office if we meet in person. So is that okay with y'all? All right. So Thursday's class will meet on Zoom, and I will see you all on Zoom on Thursday. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I have, oh, actually, is it okay if I answer the question like verbally that was in the chat?
Yes, yes.
So, I just commentary. I work for Aggie Welcome and Orientation. So, I'm a little bit familiar with the lack of participation that freshmen are, receiving. And it's actually been brought to our attention that a lot of freshmen, well, a lot of students, but specifically freshmen, are feeling quite lonely and under stimulated, which makes a ton of sense. So, if you do a programming thing, I think that's a great idea. Whatever it is, like if it has some sort of component that kind of teaches freshmen to reach out to each other, that would be awesome. Because I think that is something we're seeing. We've got a lot of freshmen who have dropped out because they're really overwhelmed by this sort of thing. So it's a great idea. It's definitely true that they have been missing out. And the only challenge that I want to emphasize is that a lot of clubs are going empty right now. A lot of events are being put on and no one's participating. So just keep that in mind, that even though these students would benefit greatly from one of these interactions, it's also very apparent that several of them just really aren't putting themselves out there, regardless of how easy it is to do. So,
All right, good to know.
Yeah, good luck. If you have any suggestions or need any help, we have an entire orientation office that could really use something to do other than make bags. So, good luck. Great idea.
Good to know. Thank you so much, Anna.
You bet. You have a good one. Bye.
Bye.
One here. All right, we left off, I believe. Let's see. Right here. This was the last slide that I talked about. I talked about Abigail Adams and about Deborah Sampson, who dressed as Robert Shurtleff and served in the Massachusetts militia for 2 years toward the end of the war. And my point here in this lecture is that women's lives did change some as a result of the American Revolution, but not to a huge degree, that it's a fairly subtle set of changes, as we're going to see. After the Revolutionary War was fought, the sort of reigning idea that came to be applied to women was called Republican motherhood. That is, in the early republic, which is the United States in the constitutional period, it was thought to be important for citizens, young people who are going to grow up to be political participants, to be able to read, to write, to think critically, to have the right sort of moral values for participation in a democratic republic. And who was it that was going to teach young children, especially boys, their new role in this new country? Mothers. So motherhood was talked about almost as though it was the fourth branch of government in this time period. It was important, if you're going to have mothers charged with the responsibility of teaching their sons how to be good Republican citizens, it was important for them to be literate, to know how to read and write. So education started to be thought of as more important for women, not just so that they would be good partners to their husbands, but also so that they could educate their children. People started to talk more about the necessity for complementarity or equality in marriage, not equality in terms of, responsibilities, but equality at least in terms of moral stature and also intelligence. People were talking about women's rights in a larger framework in this period. Mary Wollstonecraft in 1792, she was English, so in England, wrote Vindication of the Rights of Women. And she really set out the first well-known statement calling for women's equality, attacking a mode of educating women that kind of consigned them to a perpetual childhood. She called for women to be able to study things like medicine and politics and business, and to have basic civil and political rights, and to be able to support themselves without having to get married. But Wollstonecraft's ideas were considered quite radical for the time. So they were sort of beyond what most American women even were advocating for. How were women educated in this period? Well, wealthy women, women from genteel families, normally went to finishing schools after having been educated at home. Finishing schools were schools where young women of quality learned how to do things that would make them an ornament to their future husbands. So they learned how to speak French, how to draw, how to sing and play musical instruments, and also how to do fancy embroidery. In the common schools, which were just, the normal sort of in the North public schools at the time, girls were taught to read and write, but they also were taught how to sew, because sewing was thought to be an extremely important skill for women to know. And they worked on samplers in order to sort of learn their alphabet and also learn how to do all of the stitches that you might have to do in plain or fancy sewing. Like the textbooks that I showed you on Tuesday that had moral lessons taken from the Bible, these samplers had uplifting or Christian or moral messages. I'll give you an example. One of them said, "How should we scorn these clothes of flesh, these fetters and this load, and long for evening to undress, that we may rest with God?" So some young woman, probably less than a teenager, is writing about or is embroidering about looking forward to decomposition of her body after death, because you get to shrug off your load of cares and bodily pains and go be with God. So pretty serious sentiment there. Any questions so far? There was some talk about expanding the curriculum for women in this period. The best known proposal was made by Benjamin Rush. Benjamin Rush was a doctor who lived in Philadelphia, and he became famous because there was in 1793 a yellow fever epidemic that spread through the city and killed a lot of people. And he was one of the only people with suggestions that were efficacious about how to calm the pandemic. But he also recommended that women study reading and grammar and penmanship, and that they were numerate, and that they study history and philosophy. And he didn't recommend that women learn Latin and Greek, because they were not going to go on to politically participate. And knowing Latin and Greek and knowing about the ancient Greeks and Romans was thought to be part of the high school curriculum for boys, necessary to train them for political participation, but not so much for women. Still, Benjamin Rush is kind of a rare voice in this period, calling for women to have a more equal educational opportunity to those of their brothers. I noticed some of you have already participated in the discussion area for this week, and you will notice that One of the best sellers of the 1790s is excerpted in there. Charlotte Temple was a book that was really written to appeal to women. It's the story of a woman who was seduced and abandoned by a roguish man. So people really like to read these kinds of romance novels, but there was a big social discourse about whether they were bad for women. So just like people talk about, oh, are violent video games bad for children? Or should children watch the television news if it's violent? Men actually had conversations like, is it okay for women to read novels? Or would it be better if they just read history books because novels kind of rot your brain? Or should women be reading at all? I mean, do women really need to know how to read because it takes time away from their household chores? Okay. I've noted before in a previous lecture that American education was seen as a way to guarantee the virtue of the new nation. So we have Republican motherhood as part of that, and then we have the education of children in common schools as another important part of that. We've already seen that in the colonial period, Massachusetts had laws that provided for common schools, that for every town that had 50 students in it, the town fathers had to endow a school. And if it had more than 100 families living in it, they had to endow a secondary school. Now education in the North was becoming much more organized. There's more of a pattern. Generally speaking, children learn the rudiments of reading and writing at home from their mothers. Those children who didn't learn from their mothers were educated in what were called dame schools. A dame school is kind of like an 18th century or 19th century daycare center run by a fee, or run by a neighborhood woman for a fee, who would, hear young children recite their letters and their basic reading skills from a horn book while she spun yarn and knitted. After learning the rudiments of education, in the 18th and early 19th century, boys were sent to a one-room schoolhouse that normally was not open all year round. One-room schoolhouses were pretty modest in their contents. People usually sat on a backless form, so they didn't have desks. There were often dirt floors, bark roofs, no glass in the windows. The whole structure would be heated by a fireplace, but the schoolmaster, and it was almost invariably a man at the beginning of the 19th century, the schoolmaster often was no more than a teenager himself, was teaching primary school in order to put himself through secondary school, and was in charge of doing things like lighting the fires in the schoolroom and sweeping. He also had to make the pens himself from goose quills, and each family supplied its own homemade ink. Students wrote on large pieces of paper that were folded into copybooks about the size of small blue books, but they would have to draw the lines on the paper themselves. People had not enough textbooks. They used whatever was available, and the textbooks were passed on from one generation to the next. You guys saw the New England Primer. I showed you that on the second page of this lecture, I believe. Schools in the early Republic took the responsibility for socializing children, molding them into good citizens, and so a lot of the language in the primers was meant to teach people good sort of American values. So I'll give you some examples. Anti-monarchical rhymes were in there, like, quote, "Kings should be good, no men of blood," and, quote, "Britain's king in spleen lost states 13," and "Queens and kings are gaudy things." Children also were taught moral lessons like respect your elders and it's always good to be busy. So I'm going to read to you a little reading lesson from Webster's spelling book. You will notice this has all one-syllable words so that young children could read this, but it also has a moral message. Quote, "A good child will not lie, swear, nor steal. He will be good at home and ask to read his book. When he gets up, he will wash his hands and face clean. He will comb his hair and make haste to school. He will not play by the way as bad boys do." Another way to inculcate good, moral virtues was by corporal punishment, which was extremely widespread in this period. However, schoolmasters, if they were teenagers, had to be careful because sometimes they would have scholars who were bigger and stronger than they were. Children often couldn't attend school regularly, so sometimes in order to achieve the basics of literacy, people would continue going to primary school until they were in their late teens. There were many examples of people breaking up the school, by which I mean the older scholars would rebel against the schoolmaster and chase him out of town. Let me see if I have another. Okay, so here are a few examples. You can see that people learn to read phonetically in table 2, words of one syllable. And then they learn to read longer words by breaking them up into syllables. The legal status of women didn't change dramatically as a result of the American Revolution. There were a few things that changed. In some parts of New England and in Pennsylvania, divorces were easier to obtain. In most states, a married woman could petition the state government to get permission to carry on her own business. After the revolution, widows were not guaranteed at least a third of the estate of their deceased husbands. But really, that was about it that changed in terms of women's legal status. Married women's property protection comes a lot later in the 19th century. All right, so here are some pictures of children and their parents. On the left, Lucy Mygat and her son, George. Any questions about this picture? Anything strike you?
That doesn't look like a son
All right. All
or a
kids.
child.
Yeah. The face is a little weird. And this is kind of typical of folk art in this period, that it's very stark looking, not very modeled. And I mean, it doesn't have a lot of depth. These faces on the right-hand side have a lot more depth. They're done by a much more skilled painter. But George here is dressed like all little boys would have been dressed in this period. They didn't get to wear breeches or shorts, that is, until they were 4 or 5 years old. So they were, in their clothing, indistinguishable from girl babies up until that time, and they grew their hair long. Here are some more kids. A baby with a teething ring, no idea whether that is a boy or a girl from the picture. Wealthy Jones, Winter, and her sister Sarah. And then probably a girl with one shoe off. So you see that, children in this time period are being made to look more like children in their portraits, but still there's not a lot of toys or anything that they're playing with except in this Mann and Elizabeth Page here. Okay.